Captain Elena Carter had always been told she flew like she was born with wings. From the moment she sat in the cockpit of a fighter jet during her military service, she knew she belonged in the sky. By the age of 37, she had logged over 15,000 flight hours, flown across 6 continents, and earned the respect of pilots worldwide. She had faced the most treacherous weather, navigated emergency landings, and flown through combat zones. Yet, on a crisp December morning at North Star Airlines headquarters, her wings were clipped, not by turbulence or engine failure, but by 7 simple words that would change everything. "Captain Carter, we need you to wait outside." The words stung more than she wanted to admit. Elena had never expected her first day as senior captain at North Star Airlines to be easy, but she had also never imagined that she would be dismissed before even stepping foot in the briefing room. She had worked tirelessly to earn her place in the aviation industry. Yet in that moment, she felt reduced to an outsider. The morning fog hung low over the tarmac at O'Hare International Airport as Elena pulled her pilot's case behind her, walking through the sprawling terminal. Dressed in her immaculate navy blue uniform, the 4 gold stripes on her sleeve caught the bright fluorescent light. The 5:30 a.m. briefing for Flight NS-27 to San Francisco was in 15 minutes, and she had just enough time to grab a coffee before meeting her crew. Normally, the pre-flight ritual calmed her, a moment of peace before the high-stakes responsibility of piloting a commercial aircraft. But today, something felt different. After months of rigorous applications, interviews, and assessments, today marked her first official flight as a senior captain for North Star, one of the most prestigious airlines in the country. She had flown for years as a commercial pilot, but this position was supposed to be the culmination of her hard work, a long overdue acknowledgement of her skills. As she entered the crew lounge, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and conversations hummed in the background. Pilots and flight attendants huddled around tables, reviewing flight plans and scrolling through their devices. As she moved toward the coffee station, she felt the shift in the room, the brief pause in conversations, the curious glances, the subtle change in energy. She was used to it. According to recent statistics, less than 1% of commercial airline pilots were black women. To many in this room, she was an anomaly. "You must be Captain Carter," a voice said behind her. Turning, Elena found herself face to face with Captain Richard Whitman, a man in his mid-50 seconds with salt and pepper hair and the same 4 gold stripes on his sleeve. His smile was professional, but there was something unreadable in his expression. "Welcome to North Star," he said, offering his hand. "Thank you, sir," she replied, shaking it firmly. "It's an honor to join the team." "Richard, please," he corrected, though his tone lacked warmth. "I'll be your check captain for the next few weeks. I assume you've reviewed the flight path for today?" "Yes, sir," Elena answered. "I've memorized North Star's approach procedures for SFO. We're expecting some turbulence over the Rockies, but nothing unusual for this time of year." Whitman nodded, his expression neutral. "Good. The crew is waiting in briefing room C. I'll meet you there in 5. As he walked away, a knot formed in Elena's stomach. Years of experience had taught her to read people quickly, a necessary skill when working in an environment where clear communication could mean life or death. And something about Whitman's demeanor set off silent alarms. He wasn't the first man she had encountered who smiled while silently calculating all the ways she might fail. Taking a deep breath, she poured her coffee and caught a glimpse of her reflection in the metallic surface of the coffee machine. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "You have to be twice as good to get half as far." She had lived by those words her entire career, graduating top of her class at the Air Force Academy, serving 8 years as a military transport pilot, flying 3 tours in Afghanistan, and transitioning to commercial aviation with an impeccable record. But none of that mattered now. Inside briefing room C, 6 flight attendants and her CO pilot, First Officer James Chen, were already seated around the table. James, a young Asian-American pilot with 5 years of experience, stood up as she entered. "Captain Carter," he greeted her with a genuine smile. "I've heard great things. Looking forward to flying with you." Before Elena could respond, the door swung open. Thomas Barrett, the airline's executive operations director, entered, followed closely by Whitman. Barrett, a tall man with a perpetual frown, cleared his throat. "There's been a change of plans," he announced, deliberately avoiding Elena's gaze. "Captain Whitman will be taking command of Flight NS-27 today. Captain Carter, we need you to wait outside while we reassign you." Silence fell over the room. Elena felt every eye on her as heat crept up her neck. "May I ask why?" she said, struggling to keep her voice even. "I was scheduled for this flight weeks ago." Barrett glanced at Whitman before replying. "It's a matter of experience. San Francisco is a challenging approach, and given your unfamiliarity with our protocols." "With all due respect," Elena interjected, I've flown into SFO 73 times over the past decade, including in severe weather. My qualifications were thoroughly reviewed during the hiring process. Barrett's tone hardened. Captain Carter, this isn't up for discussion. Please wait outside. Elena considered pushing back, but she knew this wasn't the moment. This wasn't the battle to fight, not yet anyway. With as much dignity as she could muster, she nodded, set her flight documents down, and walked out of the room. The hallway felt colder than it had moments before. Leaning against the wall, her mind raced. In her 20 years of flying, she had faced discrimination in countless forms, from passengers requesting a different pilot upon seeing her, to colleagues making snide comments about affirmative action. But this felt different, more calculated, more deliberate. And deep down, Elena knew this was just the beginning. Captain Elena Carter stood outside Briefing Room C, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had been prepared for challenges. After all, being a black female senior captain in a field where less than 1% of commercial pilots looked like her meant she had always been expected to prove herself. But this wasn't just resistance. This was deliberate exclusion, a clear message that no matter how qualified she was, North Star Airlines had no intention of letting her lead. She took a slow, controlled breath. She had faced worse: combat flights over Afghanistan, emergency landings in brutal storms. But somehow this small hallway outside a conference room felt more suffocating than any cockpit she had ever sat in. Just as she was considering her next move, the door opened. Instead of Barrett or Whitman, it was James Chen, her assigned co-pilot. His face was tense, his movements cautious as he stepped into the hallway, glancing around as if ensuring no one was watching. "Captain Carter," he said in a low voice, "for what it's worth, I think this is complete nonsense." Elena crossed her arms. "What did they say after I left?" James hesitated, his gaze flickering down the hall before answering. "They claimed it was standard procedure for new captains, said you needed more time to acclimate to North Star's operations." Elena's jaw tightened. "And how many other captains went through this standard procedure on their first day?" James looked uncomfortable. "In my 3 years here, none." That was all she needed to hear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't about protocols. This was about control, about sending a message. And the message was clear: they wanted her to quit before she ever got the chance to fly. James ran a hand through his hair, clearly debating whether to say more. Finally, he leaned in slightly. "They're assigning you to Flight 422 to Seattle." Elena frowned. "Who's captaining that flight?" James sighed. "Captain Harold Wilson." A chill ran through her spine. She had never met Captain Wilson personally, but his reputation preceded him. The airline industry was small, and stories traveled fast. Wilson had been flying for over 30 years, making him one of North Star's most senior captains. He was also vocally against diversifying the pilot ranks. Elena had read the subtle comments in industry interviews, heard the whispers from other pilots, how Wilson referred to diversity initiatives as lowering the standards, how he believed the cockpit was no place for social experiments. And now, she was supposed to shadow him. It was an insult, and everyone knew it. Elena exhaled sharply. "I see." James hesitated. "Captain, if you want to file a complaint, I'll back you up." Elena studied him. She could see the sincerity in his face, the quiet frustration of a man who wanted to do the right thing, but also understood the risks. Filing a complaint on her first day would only confirm their suspicions, that she was difficult, that she couldn't fit into North Star's culture. No, she had played this game before. There was a time to fight and a time to wait. "Let me handle Flight 422 first," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I appreciate the offer." James nodded, though she could see the concern in his eyes. "Just be careful with Wilson. He could be old-fashioned." Elena almost laughed at the euphemism. "I've dealt with old-fashioned before." As expected, Captain Wilson barely acknowledged her when she arrived at the gate. A man in his early 60s, with thinning gray hair and an air of unshakable authority. He offered only the bare minimum of civility, a curt nod before turning his attention back to the flight plans. Elena took her assigned seat in the jump seat behind the cockpit, watching and listening as Wilson and First Officer Peter Lawson went through the pre-flight checklist. It didn't take long for Wilson's condescension to emerge. "I don't know what kind of operation you came from, Captain Carter," he remarked without looking at her. "But at North Star, we do things by the book. No shortcuts, no improvisations." Elena kept her voice neutral. "Standardization is the foundation of safety." Wilson grunted in response, seemingly disappointed she hadn't taken the bait. For 2 hours, as they flew toward Seattle, Elena endured the quiet hostility. Wilson narrated his actions in a way that felt less like instruction and more like an attempt to belittle her experience, as if she had never flown before. She let it slide. She absorbed every word, every passive-aggressive comment, knowing this wasn't just about today. They were testing her. And then it happened. During the descent into Seattle, Wilson made a mistake. It was minor but noticeable. He entered the wrong radio frequency for approach control. Elena hesitated for only a second before speaking. "Captain, I believe Seattle approach is on 2008.35 today, not 124.75. The cockpit went silent. Wilson's shoulders tensed before he checked the approach chart. A beat of silence. Then, "That's correct." His voice was stiff as he corrected the frequency. "Thank you, Captain Carter." The acknowledgement clearly cost him. As they taxied to the gate, he surprised her once more. "You have a good eye," he admitted. "Most wouldn't have caught that." Elena met his gaze in the cockpit mirror. "Thank you, sir." But then his voice hardened again. "Don't misunderstand," he said. "One good catch doesn't make you North Star material. This airline has standards, traditions. Not everyone fits." The message couldn't have been clearer if he had spelled it out. Elena felt a slow, steady anger rise inside her. She chose her words carefully. "With respect, Captain, traditions evolve. They have to." Wilson finally turned to face her, his pale blue eyes cold. "Not at North Star, they don't." By the time they returned to Chicago, Elena already knew the game being played. The next morning, she was told she would be shadowing different captains for the rest of the week, all men with reputations similar to Wilson's. The pattern was clear. They were trying to break her down, trying to make her quit. But Elena had spent her entire career proving people wrong, and if North Star's leadership thought they could force her out, they had vastly underestimated her. Captain Elena Carter sat in silence as the Boeing 737 taxied toward the gate at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The conversation with Captain Harold Wilson still lingered in her mind, his words a thinly veiled declaration that she didn't belong at North Star Airlines. But she had belonged in the sky long before North Star had ever heard her name. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "You have to be twice as good to get half as far." It wasn't just about one condescending captain or a single unfair reassignment. Something larger was at play. This wasn't resistance to change. It was a coordinated effort to push her out. And the more she thought about it, the more certain she became. As she stepped off the plane, she caught sight of James Chen waiting near the crew area. He had flown a different route that day, but his face told her everything before he even spoke. "It happened again, didn't it?" he asked. Elena nodded. "They're assigning me to shadow different captains for the rest of the week." James exhaled sharply. "That's not normal." "I know." They walked in silence for a moment before James lowered his voice. "Look, I've seen this before, not just with pilots, but flight attendants and mechanics too. The company makes the job so unbearable that people just quit." Elena's eyes darkened. "And then what? They get to say diversity hires don't work?" James hesitated before nodding. "That's exactly what they want." The next few days only confirmed Elena's suspicions. She was scheduled for back-to-back flights with captains notorious for being resistant to change. Men like Captain Andrew Peterson, who barely spoke to her during an entire flight to Denver, and Captain Robert Hayes, who spent most of their pre-flight briefing mansplaining basic aviation procedures, as if she were a student pilot. None of these men outright refused to work with her, but the message was clear: she was an unwanted presence, a problem they hoped would solve itself if they applied enough pressure. Then there were the logistical challenges. Her rest times were cut to the absolute minimum, her flight assignments were shifted at the last minute, and she was forced to sit through unnecessary retraining sessions that no other senior captain had to complete. It was all deliberate. It wasn't just about making her job harder, it was about creating a record. If she protested, they'd brand her as difficult. If she made a single mistake, they'd say she was unqualified. Elena had seen this playbook before, and she refused to let them write her out of the story. One evening, after another exhausting day, Elena sat in her apartment, going over North Star's pilot roster. She had always known there weren't many women captains, let alone black women, but now she was documenting the pattern. Of the 200-plus senior captains, less than 10% were women. Only 2 were black men. And she was the only black woman in a senior captain role. The numbers alone were damning, but it got worse. Scrolling through employee reviews on airline job sites, she noticed a pattern. White male pilots left glowing comments about North Star's strong leadership and tight-knit community. Female and minority employees? Their reviews were filled with phrases like "old boys club," "hard to advance," and "unspoken barriers." One comment from a former flight attendant stood out: "If you're not part of the club, you don't get promoted." If you speak up, they find a way to push you out. Elena clenched her jaw. This wasn't just her battle. This was systemic. Determined to dig deeper, she decided to speak with someone inside the system. That someone was Lauren Kim, a senior flight attendant she had met during her onboarding week. Lauren had been at North Star for over 7 years, long enough to see how things really worked. When they met for coffee the next morning, Lauren didn't hesitate. "They're trying to get rid of you," she said bluntly. Elena stirred her coffee slowly. "I figured as much." Lauren leaned in. "They've done this before. 3 years ago, we had a black female first officer, Michelle Rivers. She was on track to become captain, passed every test, had a flawless record." "What happened?" Elena asked, though she already knew the answer. Lauren sighed. "They started making things hard for her, delayed her upgrade process, gave her the worst schedules, kept her under review for months. Eventually, she left." "She quit?" "She had no choice." Elena exhaled slowly. "So that's how they do it. They don't fire you, they force you to walk away." Lauren nodded. "It's a pattern, Elena. I've seen it with pilots, flight attendants, even ground crew. If you're not what they want, they make your life hell until you leave." Elena's grip on her cup tightened. Not this time. Later that evening, Elena received a text message from an unknown number. "Unknown, heard what they're doing to you. You're not alone. Let's talk. Hangar 34, 7:30 p.m. She knew it was risky, but her gut told her to go. At 7:30 sharp, she arrived at Hangar 34. A lone figure stood near one of the parked aircraft, Marcus Jefferson, a black maintenance technician with over 20 years at North Star. "Captain Carter," he greeted her. "I heard you've been asking questions." Elena nodded. "I want to know how deep this goes." Marcus exhaled. "Deeper than you think. The discrimination, that's just one part of it." She frowned. "What do you mean?" Marcus glanced around before lowering his voice. "They're cutting corners on maintenance, Captain. Planes that should be grounded are being cleared for takeoff." A cold chill ran down Elena's spine. "That's illegal." Marcus nodded grimly. "And it's worse than you realize." Elena had walked into a battle she wasn't prepared for, but now she knew exactly what she was fighting against. And she wasn't backing down. Captain Elena Carter stood in the dimly lit hangar, her pulse steady but her mind racing. The words Marcus Jefferson had just spoken echoed in her ears. "They're cutting corners on maintenance. Planes that should be grounded are being cleared for takeoff." For a moment, she simply stared at him, processing the implications. Aviation safety was not negotiable. There were rules, strict protocols, and countless checks designed to prevent catastrophe. But if North Star Airlines was deliberately falsifying maintenance records, and if pilots like her were being pushed out to keep them quiet, this was no longer just about discrimination. This was about lives at risk. Elena took a deep breath. "Do you have proof?" Marcus hesitated before nodding. "Not on me, but I've been keeping records." Elena's stomach clenched. "Why haven't you reported it?" Marcus's bitter laugh told her everything she needed to know. "Reported to who?" "Management is in on it. The last guy who raised concerns, Paul Decker, fell from a maintenance platform. Broken back, career over." A slow, cold anger settled in Elena's chest. They weren't just covering up negligence. They were silencing people. Marcus glanced around before stepping closer. "They're watching you, Captain. I know what they did with your flight assignments. They want you gone." Elena exhaled slowly. "Then they'll be disappointed." She turned to leave, but Marcus's voice stopped her. "Captain," she looked back. "Be careful, you're stepping on dangerous ground." Elena nodded. "So are they." The next morning, Elena reported for duty, assigned once again to shadow another captain, this time on a red-eye flight from Chicago to Las Vegas. At first, the assignment seemed uneventful. Captain Robert Hayes, a grizzled pilot in his late 50s, barely acknowledged her presence as he reviewed the flight plan. Elena sat silently in the jump seat behind him, and First Officer Peter Lawson, observing as they prepared for takeoff. But something felt off. It wasn't just Hayes' dismissive attitude or the thinly veiled condescension in his tone when he addressed her. It was the maintenance log in front of her. Elena had memorized North Star's maintenance protocols during training. She knew exactly how long routine checks should take. But when she glanced at the entries for their aircraft, something didn't add up. The dates on the intake valve inspections didn't align with the last recorded maintenance session. The documentation looked hurried, as if someone had rushed to cover something up. She felt her heartbeat quicken. "Captain Hayes," she said carefully, "these maintenance records look inconsistent. Have they been cross-checked?" Hayes barely looked up. "Ground crew cleared it." Elena's jaw tightened. "That's not what I asked." The first officer shot her a nervous glance, but Hayes simply shrugged. "If there was a real issue, they would have flagged it, or they had been pressured not to." Elena could feel the weight of Marcus's warning. They're cutting corners. Planes that should be grounded are being cleared for takeoff. She had a choice. Ignore it and move on, like North Star wanted her to. Or stand her ground. Her decision was immediate. I'd like an additional inspection. Hayes' head snapped up. That's unnecessary. I disagree. Tension crackled in the cockpit. The first officer shifted uncomfortably, but Elena didn't waver. Hayes exhaled sharply. Fine, but if this delays our departure, you're explaining it to operations. Elena didn't respond. She didn't care about North Star's on-time performance ratings, she cared about safety. The extra 20-minute delay was met with irritation from the airline, but when maintenance double-checked the aircraft, Elena's suspicions were confirmed. The intake valve inspection had been forged, the plane hadn't actually been checked in over 2 months. A malfunction at 35,000 feet could have been catastrophic. Hayes said nothing as they finally pushed back from the gate, but his silence was heavy with resentment. The next morning, Elena was summoned to executive operations. She wasn't surprised. Thomas Barrett sat behind his glass-walled desk, his expression tight. Richard Whitman stood nearby, arms crossed, and a legal representative sat silently in the corner. Elena folded her arms. You wanted to see me? Barrett didn't waste time. Captain Carter, I understand you delayed Flight 889 last night. Unnecessarily. Elena kept her expression neutral. The maintenance logs had inconsistencies that required further inspection. Barrett's voice hardened. Our ground crew is highly trained. You overruled their clearance. Because they missed a critical issue. Silence. Whitman leaned forward. Captain Carter, delays cost this company thousands of dollars. Elena met his gaze evenly. And how much does a crash cost? The lawyer in the corner shifted uncomfortably. Barrett exhaled through his nose, his patience thinning. We value efficiency alongside safety, Captain. If you can't trust our established procedures, perhaps this isn't the right environment for you. A threat. Elena didn't blink. Are you suggesting I should ignore discrepancies in maintenance logs? Barrett's jaw tightened. I'm suggesting you use better judgment in the future. Elena smiled coldly. I always do. She rose, turning toward the door. Captain Carter. She paused. Barrett's voice was low, dangerous. This isn't the military. There are rules here. You need to learn them. Elena turned back, her calm. Mask unshaken. Funny. I thought North Star's first rule was safety. With that, she walked out. That night she sat in her apartment, sorting through every note, every observation, every red flag she had encountered since joining North Star. This wasn't just about discrimination, it was organized negligence. They weren't just trying to push her out, they were trying to silence her before she uncovered something worse. Her phone vibrated. A message from Marcus. Marcus, we need to talk. Meet me at Bay 34. This is bigger than we thought. Elena exhaled, her decision already made. They wanted her to fall in line. Instead, they had just given her every reason to fight. Captain Elena Carter sat in her dimly lit apartment, staring at the collection of notes and documents she had gathered over the past few weeks. Maintenance discrepancies, forged inspection logs, deliberate hazing tactics. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of systemic negligence at North Star Airlines. This wasn't just about her being pushed out. This was about planes taking off with known safety risks, and no one in leadership seemed to care. Her phone vibrated. Marcus, we need to talk. Meet me at Bay 34. This is bigger than we thought. Elena exhaled. She had known this was coming. She grabbed her jacket, tucked her notes away, and headed for the North Star maintenance hangar. Bay 34 was at the far end of North Star's maintenance complex, quiet, isolated, away from the main terminal where executives could keep a watchful eye. Marcus Jefferson was already there, leaning against a steel toolbox. He looked up as Elena approached, his expression grim. Thanks for coming, Captain, he said. Elena crossed her arms. You said this was bigger than we thought. What do you mean? Marcus glanced around before pulling out a USB drive. I've been collecting evidence for months. Photos, maintenance logs, emails, everything. Elena took the drive but didn't look at it yet. What exactly are we dealing with? Marcus rubbed a hand over his face as if trying to figure out how to put it into words. North Star is cutting corners on everything. Valve inspections, hydraulic system checks, even structural integrity reports. Planes that should be in maintenance for days are getting cleared in hours. And it's not just laziness, it's pressure from the top. Barrett and his people don't want delays. Elena's blood ran cold. So they're gambling with people's lives. Marcus nodded. And here's the worst part. They're targeting employees who speak up. That's why Paul Decker fell off that maintenance platform. He found something they didn't want getting out. Elena tightened her grip on the USB drive. What did he find? Marcus hesitated. A weakness in the engine mount bolts on the older 787 seconds. If one of those fails mid-flight. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Elena felt sick. How many planes are affected? At least 30% of the fleet. Silence stretched between them. Then Marcus spoke again, his voice lower. Captain, I have 3 kids. I need this job, but I can't ignore this anymore. If we don't do something, people will die. Elena met his eyes. Then we do something. The next morning, Elena arrived at North Star's operations office, pretending nothing had changed. She had memorized every detail from Marcus's files the night before, but she had to be careful. She had one chance to expose this. She pulled James Chen aside before the briefing. James, I need your help. James glanced around, lowering his voice. What's going on? Elena handed him a photo from Marcus's files, a maintenance clearance form that had been falsified. This plane flew last week, she said. It was supposed to be grounded. James's eyes widened as he scanned the document. Elena, if this is real, it is. James exhaled sharply. What do you need me to do? Check last week's flight reports. See if there were any mechanical issues mid-flight that matched this clearance. James hesitated. If they catch me looking, I know. Be careful. He gave her a tight nod. You too. Later that day, Elena was assigned to shadow Captain Peterson on a cross-country flight to New York. She knew the real reason. North Star was keeping her busy, trying to grind her down until she quit. But now she had a different reason for accepting the flight. She needed to see the maintenance reports herself. Before takeoff, she discreetly checked the logs. Her stomach dropped. The aircraft they were about to fly, Flight 672 to New York, had one of the falsified maintenance records from Marcus's files. It was cleared for flight despite an issue with its hydraulic pressure system. Elena immediately approached Captain Peterson. I think we need a second look at this maintenance log. Peterson barely looked up. Ground crew signed off. We're good to go. Elena gritted her teeth. Captain, the last recorded check on this system doesn't match the timeline. We need another inspection. Peterson sighed. You're getting a reputation for this, Carter. Elena's temper flared. And you're getting comfortable with negligence. That got his attention. His expression darkened. I don't like being questioned, and I don't like flying unsafe planes. Peterson hesitated, but before he could argue further, the first officer, a younger pilot named Kevin Dawson, spoke up. She's right. There's an inconsistency. For a moment, Peterson seemed ready to push back, but when 2 pilots were raising the concern, he had no choice but to authorize another check. The 20-minute delay caused chaos at the operations desk. Dispatch was furious, but when the mechanics checked the hydraulic pressure system, they found the issue Marcus had flagged. It was real. Had they taken off without checking, they could have lost pressure mid-flight. Peterson looked visibly shaken as the repairs were completed. When he finally looked at Elena, his expression was unreadable. Good call, Carter. But Elena didn't feel victorious. She felt angry. How many other flights were taking off under the same risks? After landing in New York, her phone buzzed. James, found something. Meet me when you land. Elena's pulse quickened. She was running out of time. North Star had been covering this up for years, but now she had evidence, she had witnesses, and most importantly, she had momentum. Captain Elena Carter stepped off Flight 672 at JFK Airport, her mind still reeling from what had happened mid-flight. The falsified hydraulic pressure system clearance wasn't just an isolated incident, it was proof of a larger, more dangerous culture at North Star Airlines. She had already suspected that leadership was pushing her out because she didn't fit their mold. But now she realized that the discrimination wasn't just about her. It was about keeping anyone who challenged their corruption in check. She had only been at North Star for a few weeks, yet she had seen enough to know this wasn't just a case of old-fashioned bias. This was a company-wide rot, a system built to protect the powerful and silence dissenters. Her phone buzzed. James, found something. Meet me when you land. Elena took a slow breath. She was ready for answers. James Chen was waiting in a quiet corner of the crew lounge, his expression serious. He looked around cautiously before sliding into the seat across from her. I did what you asked, he said in a hushed voice. I pulled flight reports from the last 3 months, checking for issues matching Marcus's flagged maintenance problems. Elena leaned in. And? James exhaled sharply. At least 9 flights reported unexpected mechanical issues that matched the exact equipment failures Marcus said were being ignored. And that's just what was documented. A cold anger settled in Elena's chest. How many of those planes were cleared for flight under questionable maintenance logs? James hesitated before answering. All of them. Elena clenched her fists. James wasn't finished. And there's something else. I started asking around quietly. People know what's going on, Elena. They just don't talk about it. She frowned. What do you mean? James lowered his voice even more. There's a whisper network inside North Star. Pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, they all know things aren't right. But no one speaks up because they've seen what happens when you do. Elena's stomach twisted. Like what happened to Michelle Rivers? James nodded grimly. And Paul Decker, and two other first officers who suddenly failed their proficiency checks after reporting safety concerns. North Star has a way of getting rid of people who don't fall in line. That night, Elena sat alone in her hotel room, staring at her laptop screen. She had read about toxic corporate cultures before. She had even seen glimpses of it in her previous jobs. But this was different. This wasn't just about protecting egos or maintaining tradition. This was about silencing dissent with surgical precision. The more she thought about it, the more the patterns became obvious. Women and minorities were disproportionately pushed out. Anyone who questioned leadership decisions faced retaliation. Pilots who flagged safety issues found their careers mysteriously stalled. Employees who tried to report concerns were either reassigned, demoted, or let go. It was a machine, and it had been running for years. Elena pulled up employee review sites, scanning through anonymous comments. If you're not part of the inner circle, good luck advancing. I raised concerns about an unsafe aircraft. 3 weeks later, I was suddenly under review, and my contract wasn't renewed. They don't fire you, they just make you miserable until you quit. It was all there. The proof of a system designed to protect the company at any cost, even human lives. The next morning, Elena arrived at North Star's headquarters in Chicago, only to be greeted by an unexpected visitor. Richard Whitman. She had seen him around before, always watching, always calculating. He was one of North Star's senior captains and a known loyalist to executive leadership. Captain Carter, he greeted, his tone smooth but cold. Walk with me. Elena kept her expression neutral but followed. She knew what this was. As they moved through the terminal, Whitman spoke in a calm, deliberate voice. I hear you've been asking a lot of questions. Elena didn't respond. You've made quite an impression here. You're talented, no doubt. But I think you're spending too much energy looking for problems that don't exist. She let out a short laugh. Is that so? Whitman's smile didn't reach his eyes. This airline runs on trust, Captain. Trust in leadership, trust in procedure. You're new here, and maybe you don't understand how things work yet. Elena stopped walking. I understand just fine. Whitman studied her for a long moment, then his voice dropped lower. You have a good career ahead of you, but there's a right way and a wrong way to do things. If I were you, I'd stop making enemies. It wasn't advice, it was a threat. Elena held his gaze. And if I don't? Whitman's expression never changed. Then I imagine you'll find North Star a very difficult place to work. And just like that, he walked away. Elena stood there, pulse steady but anger burning in her chest. This was how they kept people in line. This was how they controlled the narrative. And now, they had decided to come after her. That night, James, Marcus, and Lauren met Elena in a quiet bar outside the city. She laid it all out, everything she had uncovered, everything they had risked their jobs to tell her. When she finished, the table was silent. Finally, Lauren spoke. So, what's the plan? Elena looked around at them. James, who had risked his own career to dig into reports. Marcus, who had spent months collecting evidence from the maintenance team. Lauren, who had seen firsthand how North Star chewed people up and spat them out. And then there was her. She had spent her whole career proving people wrong. But this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every passenger who trusted North Star with their lives. This was about every employee afraid to speak up. And now that she knew the truth, there was no turning back. She placed her hands on the table, her voice steady. We bring them down. Captain Elena Carter knew the moment she left that meeting with James, Marcus, and Lauren that she had officially crossed a line. She wasn't just a pilot facing discrimination anymore, she was a threat to North Star Airlines. And they knew it. The next morning, when she checked her schedule, the retaliation had already begun. Her flight assignments had changed overnight, without warning. Instead of being assigned to the long-haul, high-profile routes she was originally scheduled for, she was now stuck with back-to-back short-haul flights, the kind with the least rest time between shifts. Not only that, but she had been placed under routine performance review, something that almost never happened to a senior captain with her experience. Elena had been in the industry long enough to know what this was. It was an attempt to wear her down. They couldn't fire her outright, not without cause, so instead, they would make her job as miserable as possible, hoping she'd quit on her own. She had seen them do it to others before, but she wasn't others. Her first flight of the day was a 4-hour round trip from Chicago to Atlanta, followed by another immediate turnaround to Denver. Barely enough time to grab a meal between flights. And that was exactly the point. By the time she landed back in Chicago for her layover, she could feel the exhaustion creeping in. She barely had time to shower and rest before she had to be back in the cockpit at dawn. It continued for 4 days straight. Early flights, late flights, little rest, no long-haul assignments. By the end of the week, even James noticed. "They're trying to break you," he muttered as they reviewed their flight plans. Elena smirked, even though her body ached from fatigue. "Then they're going to have to try harder." On the 5th day, Elena was summoned to HR for a mandatory evaluation. The moment she walked in, she knew it was a setup. 2 men in suits sat across from her, Thomas Barrett and Richard Whitman, North Star's most senior captain. A legal representative was present as well, pretending to be neutral. "Captain Carter," Barrett said smoothly, "we've received reports that you've been struggling to integrate into North Star's team." Elena folded her arms. "Is that so?" Whitman smiled thinly. "A few captains have expressed concerns about your ability to follow procedures, and given the delays you've caused with your overcautious approach to maintenance, we felt it was time to formally assess your performance." Elena forced herself to remain calm. "By overcautious approach, you mean the time I prevented a faulty hydraulic system from failing mid-flight?" Barrett's jaw tightened. "We're simply reviewing your conduct, Captain. We need to ensure that all of our pilots operate within company expectations." Elena met his gaze without flinching. "And are those expectations based on safety regulations or executive preferences?" Silence. The legal representative cleared his throat. "This is a routine review, Captain Carter. We simply want to ensure that you are adapting to North Star's operational culture." Elena knew what this was, a paper trail. They were documenting her as a problem employee in case they needed an excuse to fire her later. She could fight it, or she could use it. She leaned back in her chair, forcing a small smile. "Of course, I'm happy to comply with any performance evaluations. In fact, I'd like my review results in writing." Whitman's expression flickered slightly, just for a second. They hadn't expected her to agree so easily. Barrett forced a smile. "Naturally." Elena nodded. "Then we're done here." And with that, she stood up and walked out. Later that day, James Chen was pulled from her next flight. When she asked why, she was given a vague response about schedule adjustments. Instead, she was assigned to First Officer Kyle Davidson, a younger, less experienced pilot she barely knew. The moment they sat in the cockpit together, Elena could tell something was off. Kyle was nervous, overly formal, hesitant in his responses. He avoided eye contact, spoke only when necessary, and seemed almost afraid to speak freely. It didn't take long for her to figure out why. They had sent him to watch her. Mid-flight, she tested the waters. "Kyle, how long have you been at North Star?" He hesitated. "Just under 2 years, Captain." "And how often do they rotate you between captains?" Another pause. "Not often." Elena smiled slightly. "So why the sudden change?" Kyle didn't answer, but his grip on the controls tightened slightly. He knew. That night, Elena met Marcus in the maintenance bay. She handed him her official performance review report, the one they had so graciously given her in writing. Marcus scanned the document, his face darkening. "They're laying the groundwork." Elena nodded. "I need to move faster." Marcus exhaled. "I've got something for you." He led her to a locked file cabinet, pulling out a stack of old maintenance logs. "These are from 3 years ago, before Decker's accident." Elena flipped through the pages, her breath catching. The exact same discrepancies, the same falsified reports, the same issues being ignored. This had been happening for years, and North Star had been covering it up the entire time. Elena closed the folder, her jaw set. They had tried to wear her down. They had tried to set her up. Now they were trying to erase her entirely, but they had underestimated her. She looked at Marcus. "Get me everything you can, every report, every name. We take this to the FAA." Marcus hesitated. "You realize what happens if you do this?" Elena exhaled. "I lose my job, maybe my career." "And you're okay with that?" She didn't even blink. "I'm not okay with letting people die because of corporate greed." Marcus studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Then let's bring them down." The next morning, Elena arrived at headquarters to find an email waiting in her inbox. Subject, immediate reassignment. They were pulling her from active flight duty and placing her in an administrative role, while her performance review continued. The final move before termination. She smiled. They had just made their last mistake. Captain Elena Carter sat in her dimly lit apartment, staring at the folder Marcus had handed her the night before. Pages upon pages of maintenance records, falsified, manipulated, and outright ignored. The same discrepancies she had flagged, the same shortcuts that put lives at risk, had been happening for years. She flipped through the logs, each one a damning piece of evidence. Faulty engine mount bolts on 787 seconds, never replaced. Hydraulic failures on 737 seconds, marked as cleared without inspection. Cracked pressure valves, patched instead of replaced. Every document pointed to one undeniable truth: North Star Airlines had been knowingly operating unsafe aircraft, falsifying maintenance reports to keep flights on schedule. Her stomach twisted. She had always known the airline was corrupt. But this was criminal. She had to act, but she had to do it smartly. The people running North Star weren't just careless executives. They were deliberate, and they protected their own. Elena needed to move carefully. She grabbed her phone and dialed James Chen. "James, we have a problem." His voice was wary. "What kind of problem?" She exhaled. "I have proof. Everything we suspected about maintenance fraud, it's worse. Much worse." There was a long pause. Then James spoke carefully. "How bad?" Elena glanced at the papers spread out before her. "Bad enough that if the FAA sees this, North Star could lose its operating license." James swore under his breath. "Elena, this is dangerous." She knew what he meant. Employees who spoke up didn't just lose their jobs. They were blacklisted from the industry, or worse. Paul Decker had found something and ended up in a hospital with a workplace accident. Would North Star do the same to her? She clenched her jaw. They wouldn't have the chance, because she was going to strike first. Elena couldn't do this alone. She met Marcus and Lauren that night in a parking lot outside a small diner, somewhere far from prying eyes. She placed the folder between them. "We have enough to take them down." Marcus flipped through the records, his jaw tightening. Lauren's face paled. Jesus, they were signing off on inspections that never happened. Marcus tapped a page with his finger. "Look at this. Paul Decker flagged this exact issue before his accident." Lauren exhaled. "So what's the plan? We go to the FAA?" Elena nodded. "Yes, but not just them." Lauren frowned. "Who else?" Elena met her eyes. "The press." Lauren visibly tensed. "Are you sure?" "Yes. The FAA could take months to investigate. North Star had lawyers, money, and influence. They could stall the process, keep things tied up in bureaucracy. But a public scandal? That would destroy them instantly." Marcus nodded slowly. "I know someone at the Tribune, a journalist who covers corporate fraud. She won't ignore this." Elena felt a surge of determination. It was time. Before they could leak the story, Elena had one last flight assignment. She'd been pulled from duty, placed under performance review, but for some reason, she was still scheduled to fly one final red-eye to Miami. She knew what this was, a test. They wanted her to make one mistake. One wrong move they could use to fire her before she exposed them. She arrived at the airport earlier than usual, making her way to the maintenance bay before her flight. She approached a technician, keeping her voice neutral. "I want to see the inspection report for Flight 214. The technician frowned. "That's not standard procedure." Elena gave a tight smile. "Neither is falsifying maintenance records." The man hesitated, then handed her the tablet. Elena scanned the report and froze. The aircraft she was scheduled to fly had been cleared despite an outdated engine turbine inspection. The log showed it had been checked 3 days ago. But Marcus's record showed the last real inspection was over 2 months ago. This plane wasn't safe. Her pulse pounded. She could refuse to fly, but they would just swap in another captain who wouldn't question it. She had one option. She turned to the technician. "Run a secondary inspection, right now." He hesitated. "Captain, that could delay the flight. Do it." The technician's eyes flickered with understanding. He nodded and got to work. 30 minutes later, they found the issue. The turbine system was compromised. Had the plane taken off without a secondary inspection, the engine could have failed mid-flight. Elena sat in the airport's operations office, arms crossed, as Thomas Barrett and Richard Whitman stormed in. "This is unacceptable," Barrett snapped. "You've delayed a scheduled flight based on paranoia." Elena tossed the inspection report onto the table. "I delayed a flight because the plane was unsafe. That's not paranoia. That's doing my job." Whitman glared at her. "You think you've won something here?" Elena smirked. "I know I have. Because at 9 a.m. that morning, Marcus had delivered the documents to the FAA. And at noon, the Chicago Tribune had published an expose on North Star Airlines' fraudulent safety practices. The headline? "North Star Airlines covering up safety violations, whistleblower speaks out." Barrett's face went pale as he checked his phone. The scandal was breaking nationwide. And North Star? It was falling apart. Elena stood up, adjusting her uniform. Barrett's eyes burned with rage. "You have no idea what you've done." Elena smiled. "Oh, I know exactly what I've done." She turned and walked out, feeling lighter than she had in weeks, because she had just saved lives, and North Star Airlines, it was about to crash. Captain Elena Carter walked out of North Star's operations office, her heart pounding but her step steady. She had just exposed a major safety violation, delaying a flight that could have ended in disaster. And now, the airline was scrambling to contain the fallout. Her exposé with the Chicago Tribune had already gone live, and within hours, the FAA had launched an official investigation. But Elena knew one thing for certain: this fight wasn't over. North Star was a company built on intimidation and cover-ups. If she was going to take them down for good, she couldn't do it alone. She needed allies inside the company. Later that evening, Elena met James, Marcus, and Lauren at a secluded diner on the outskirts of Chicago. The three of them had risked their careers to help her, and now everything was coming to a head. Lauren was the first to speak. "It's everywhere," she said, voice low but urgent. "The flight attendants are talking, the mechanics know something's up, and even some of the senior pilots are starting to ask questions." Marcus nodded. "After today's article, people are coming to me asking what's really going on. Some of them are scared, but they want answers." James exhaled. "Elena, the execs are panicking. I heard from a friend in corporate that Barrett and Whitman are holding emergency meetings. They're looking for someone to blame." Elena wasn't surprised. Barrett and Whitman were smart enough to know the walls were closing in, but they wouldn't go down without a fight. And they were going to try to pin it all on her. Lauren leaned in. "Elena, if we're doing this, we need more than just evidence. We need people willing to speak out. If it's just you, North Star will say you're a disgruntled employee, that you're lying." Elena nodded. "We need a movement, and we need people in different departments to confirm the truth." James hesitated. "Do you know what you're asking? You want people to publicly go against one of the biggest airlines in the country?" Elena met his eyes. "I know. But if we don't, North Star will sweep this under the rug like they always do." Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. "So who do we trust?" Lauren took out a list of names. "I've been keeping track of employees who've either raised concerns before or have hinted at wanting change." Elena glanced at the list. She recognized some of the names: pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, but others were new to her. James pointed to a name. "Peter Lawson, first officer. I flew with him once. He's quiet, but I don't think he supports North Star's leadership." Marcus added, "Then there's Carl Reynolds, senior engineer in maintenance. He's been at North Star for over 20 years, and from what I hear, he hates how things have changed." Elena exhaled. "All right, we bring them in. But we have to be careful. If North Star finds out what we're doing, they'll start firing people before we can expose them." Lauren smirked. "Then we don't give them the chance." The next few days were a balancing act between secrecy and action. Elena, James, Marcus, and Lauren began reaching out to trusted colleagues, gathering as much testimony as possible. It wasn't easy. Some were too afraid to speak up. Others were willing to help, but only anonymously. But then there were those who were ready to fight. Peter Lawson, the first officer James had mentioned, agreed to meet with them in a quiet break room at O'Hare Airport. He looked nervous but determined. "I don't want to lose my job," he admitted, "but I'm tired of looking the other way." Elena nodded. "You don't have to go public if you're not ready, but if you can confirm what we already know, if you've seen anything suspicious firsthand, that will help us." Peter exhaled. "I have." And then he started talking. He had seen CO pilots pressured to stay silent about mechanical issues. He had heard senior captains mock pilots who reported safety concerns, and worse, he had been personally reprimanded for questioning a maintenance report. "I was told to trust the system, but that system is broken." By the time Peter left, Elena knew they had just gained a crucial witness, and he wasn't the only one. Over the next 48 hours, Carl Reynolds from maintenance handed over internal memos proving North Star had rushed aircraft back into service without full inspections. A flight attendant named Sarah Patel confirmed that flight crews had been warned not to question safety decisions. Another pilot, Greg Howard, admitted he had personally been pressured to override safety alerts to keep flights on time. The evidence was stacking up fast. It didn't take long for North Star's leadership to catch on. By the end of the week, employees who had spoken to Elena started receiving sudden schedule changes, mandatory performance reviews, and unexpected transfers. Elena's own access to the pilot scheduling system was suddenly revoked, and then the worst happened. Marcus was suspended. He texted Elena in the middle of the night. "Marcus, they pulled me from work, said there's an ongoing investigation into my conduct." Elena's stomach twisted. They were striking back, hard. She immediately called Lauren and James. "We need to move fast. If we wait too long, they'll start firing people before we can take this public." Lauren was already ahead of her. "The Tribune wants a follow-up article. They're ready to go public with employee testimonies." James added, "The FAA investigation is underway, but we need a direct report with multiple employee statements to make it stick." Elena exhaled. This was it, the final push. The next morning, Elena, James, Lauren, and 5 other employees walked into the FAA regional office with a full report of North Star's safety violations, falsified maintenance records, and employee testimonies. At the same time, the Chicago Tribune published a bombshell story featuring anonymous first-hand accounts from pilots, flight attendants, and engineers. The headline read, "North Star Airlines, Safety Violations, Retaliation, and the Culture of Silence." Within hours, North Star's stock plummeted. By the end of the day, the FAA had officially grounded 40% of North Star's fleet pending further inspections. The company was in free fall, and for the first time since this all started, Elena could see it, the beginning of the end. Captain Elena Carter walked into North Star Airlines executive offices, her back straight, her expression unreadable. She had known this moment was coming. After weeks of investigation, countless risks, and gathering a coalition of employees willing to speak up, the truth was out in the open. The FAA was investigating. The Chicago Tribune had published damning exposés, and nearly half of North Star's fleet had been grounded due to maintenance discrepancies. The airline was in chaos, and now leadership wanted a word with her. Inside the executive boardroom, Thomas Barrett sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his jaw clenched. To his right, Richard Whitman, North Star's senior captain, watched Elena with cold calculation. On the other side of the room, 2 corporate lawyers sat stiffly, papers stacked in front of them. They weren't here to talk. They were here to contain the damage. Elena remained standing. She wasn't going to play their game. Barrett was the first to speak. "Captain Carter," he began, his voice tight, "we have a problem." Elena raised an eyebrow. "You don't say." Barrett exhaled sharply. "You've made quite the spectacle of yourself these past few weeks." Elena smirked. "That's interesting. I thought I was just doing my job." Whitman's eyes flashed with irritation. "Let's not waste time. You've been actively undermining this company, leaking confidential information, and damaging North Star's reputation. We're offering you a way out." Elena crossed her arms. "Let me guess, a resignation letter and a hefty NDA?" One of the lawyers pushed a thick contract across the table. "A generous severance package, provided you agree to cease all communication with the press and withdraw any complaints filed with the FAA." Elena picked up the document, flipping through it. It was exactly what she expected, a bribe wrapped in legal jargon. She let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "You really think I'm going to sign this?" Barrett's face darkened. "We're giving you a chance to walk away with your career intact." Elena set the contract back down. "I don't want your money. I want accountability." Whitman leaned forward, his voice lowering. "Do you really think you're going to win this, Carter? You're one person. You have no idea how this industry works." Elena smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Actually, I do. I know that airlines like North Star count on silence. They count on people being too afraid to speak up. They count on employees like me just going away." She leaned forward slightly. "But I didn't go away, did I?" Barrett's fingers drummed on the table, his irritation growing. "We could ruin you," he said, his voice cold. "Make one call, and you'll never fly again." Elena held his gaze unwavering. "You already tried, and yet here I am." Silence filled the room. They knew she wasn't bluffing, because while they had been preparing to bury her, she had been preparing to end them. Elena reached into her bag and pulled out a thin folder. She placed it on the table, sliding it toward Barrett. Whitman hesitated before flipping it open. The moment his eyes scanned the first page, his face lost all color. FAA complaint reports, whistleblower testimonies, internal maintenance documents proving North Star had falsified safety inspections for years. All cross-referenced, verified, and now sitting in the hands of federal regulators. Elena's voice was steady. "This morning, my attorney submitted a full report to the FAA, detailing every safety violation, every instance of retaliation, and every falsified document we uncovered." Barrett's grip on the folder tightened. Elena continued. "At noon, the Chicago Tribune received additional documentation proving North Star endangered passengers by knowingly operating unsafe aircraft." One of the lawyers visibly swallowed. "And in case you're thinking of burying this, I have multiple copies secured with instructions for immediate release should anything happen to me or the employees who came forward." Elena's eyes locked onto Barrett's. "So no, Mr. Barrett, I won't be signing your NDA." Barrett's hands curled into fists. Whitman slammed the folder shut. "This is blackmail," Elena smiled. "No, Captain Whitman, this is accountability." The room erupted into chaos. Barrett turned to the lawyers, his voice rising in frustration. "How much damage control can we do?" One of them shook his head. "If the FAA follows through, they'll ground our fleet. Stockholders will start pulling out immediately." Whitman stood abruptly, glaring at Elena. "You've just destroyed this airline." Elena met his gaze. "No, you did that when you put profits over safety." Barrett's phone buzzed violently on the table. He checked the screen. His face went pale. The FAA's public statement had just been released. North Star Airlines officially under federal investigation. The second lawyer grabbed his own phone. It's already spreading to national news. Elena didn't move. She had done exactly what she set out to do. Barrett turned back to her, his voice now desperate. We can negotiate. Elena shook her head. It's too late for that. She stood up, smoothing her uniform. You should be more worried about what the Justice Department will say when they get involved. Whitman looked like he was about to explode, but Elena was already heading for the door. She didn't need to hear their excuses. She had won. As she stepped out into the hallway, her phone vibrated. A message from Marcus. Marcus, FAA just ordered an emergency safety audit on North Star's fleet. You did it. Elena let out a slow breath, a feeling of deep satisfaction settling in her chest. For the first time in weeks, the weight on her shoulders felt lighter. North Star was falling apart, and she had made sure the right people would be held accountable. She walked toward the exit, the crisp Chicago air hitting her as she stepped outside. The battle wasn't over yet, but the tide had turned, and now it was North Star's leadership scrambling to survive, not her. Captain Elena Carter stepped out of North Star Airlines' executive offices, inhaling the crisp Chicago air as the weight of her confrontation settled over her. She had delivered the evidence, watched as Thomas Barrett and Richard Whitman realized their empire was crumbling, and now it was time for the next move. The FAA had opened an investigation, but that wasn't enough. North Star was a powerful airline with deep pockets and an even deeper network of influence. If they had any chance of surviving this, they would use every legal loophole and PR strategy to downplay their crimes. She wouldn't let that happen. She needed to go public. She needed the press. Elena checked her phone. Her contact at the Federal Aviation Administration, David Calloway, had left her a voicemail. Captain Carter, we received your report and supporting documents. I can confirm the investigation is officially underway. However, I need you to come in for a formal debrief. We need every detail. She didn't hesitate. She hailed a cab and headed straight for the FAA's regional headquarters. The moment she stepped inside, she was led to a conference room where Calloway and two other FAA officials sat with folders already open. Captain Carter, Calloway greeted her, shaking her hand firmly. We've been reviewing the materials. This is staggering. Elena sat down. It's worse than you think. She spent the next 2 hours detailing every red flag she had uncovered. The falsified maintenance records, the pressure placed on mechanics to sign off on unsafe planes, and the culture of retaliation against employees who spoke up. Calloway listened intently, taking notes, occasionally exchanging glances with the others. When she finished, he sighed. You realize what you've done, right? Elena met his gaze. I realize that if I hadn't done it, people could have died. Calloway nodded. We're sending inspectors to North Star's maintenance hubs immediately. If what you've reported is confirmed, this could bring the entire airline to a standstill. Elena exhaled. Good. But she knew the FAA moved slowly. Regulations, bureaucracy, and corporate pushback would delay their response. That's why she needed the media. The next morning, Elena met with Olivia Reyes, a senior investigative journalist from the Chicago Tribune. Reyes had been covering corporate scandals for years, and when Marcus had initially reached out, she was already interested in North Star's shady practices. But now, Elena was giving her everything. They met in a small coffee shop downtown, far from any place North Star employees might recognize her. Olivia was direct. I need to know exactly what you have, Carter. If I go public with this, I need bulletproof facts. Elena slid a USB drive across the table. Inside, you'll find maintenance logs proving North Star falsified safety reports, testimonies from employees, and emails from leadership pressuring staff to clear unsafe planes. Olivia plugged the drive into her laptop, scrolling through the files. Her expression darkened. This is worse than I expected. Elena took a sip of her coffee. It always is. Olivia looked up. You understand what happens next, right? Once I publish this, North Star will do everything they can to destroy you. Elena nodded. They've been trying to destroy me since the moment I set foot in their briefing room. Olivia smirked. Fair point. She closed her laptop. I'll need to verify everything, reach out to additional sources and get legal clearance. But when this drops, it's going to be big. Elena exhaled. Good. Make it impossible for them to bury. Olivia's eyes glinted. That's the plan. 3 days later, at 6 a.m., Elena's phone buzzed. James, turn on the news. Now. She grabbed the remote, flipping to the morning news. And there it was. Breaking news, North Star Airlines under investigation for falsifying safety reports. The Chicago Tribune's article had gone live, and within hours, the story had exploded across the country. Passengers, former employees, and even investors were demanding answers. On live television, FAA spokespersons confirmed the launch of a full investigation, and North Star's executives were scrambling to control the narrative. Barrett and Whitman had gone silent. North Star's PR team issued a weak, carefully crafted statement claiming they were committed to safety and taking these allegations seriously. But it wasn't working, because the employees were speaking out. Lauren, James, and Marcus had agreed to be anonymous sources for the Tribune, and now their testimonies were being read by millions of people. The whisper network inside North Star had shattered. Flight attendants, mechanics, and even some pilots began leaking information, confirming everything Elena had exposed. And then, the final blow landed. By noon, the FAA had announced a temporary suspension of North Star's most critical routes. The reason? Irregularities in maintenance reports require further review. It was the beginning of the end. Elena sat back, watching the news coverage, feeling a mix of relief and adrenaline. James texted again. "James, they're losing control. I don't think they can recover from this." Elena took a slow breath. Neither did she. As she stood to get more coffee, her phone rang. Unknown number. She let it ring twice before answering. "Captain Carter," a familiar voice said smoothly. "Barrett." Elena didn't say anything, waiting for him to speak. "You think you've won?" he said, voice low, cold. "This isn't over." Elena smiled to herself. "It is for you." She ended the call because it didn't matter what Barrett thought. North Star was going down, and she had made sure of it. Captain Elena Carter sat in her apartment, watching the news unfold. North Star Airlines was in freefall. The FAA had launched a full-scale investigation. Major investors were pulling out, and now flight cancellations were piling up as more employees came forward. She had done what she set out to do. She had exposed them. She had forced them into a crisis they couldn't contain. But she also knew what was coming next. Her phone buzzed, an email from HR. She didn't have to read it to know what it said. Still, she clicked it open. Subject: immediate termination. Dear Captain Carter, after a thorough internal review, North Star Airlines has determined that your actions have violated company policy. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated. You are required to return all company-issued equipment and refrain from any further communication regarding internal company matters. We appreciate your time with North Star and wish you success in future endeavors. Elena let out a short laugh. So this was it? After everything, this was how they thought they could shut her up. She picked up her phone and dialed James. The moment he answered, she said, "Well, it finally happened. They fired me." James swore under his breath. "Elena, I'm so sorry." She cut him off. "Don't be. This was always going to happen." James hesitated. "What are you going to do now?" Elena exhaled. "I'm going to finish what I started." Within 24 hours, North Star's damage control team went into overdrive. They released an official statement claiming that Elena had been terminated for misconduct and that her accusations were misleading. They tried to paint her as a rogue employee, someone who was bitter, reckless, and seeking attention. But it wasn't working. The FAA investigation was still ongoing, and more employees were leaking damning evidence. Then something unexpected happened. Pilots from other airlines started speaking up. Former North Star employees who had been forced out under similar circumstances were now sharing their own stories, confirming that this was not just about Elena, it was about an entire company that had been built on silence and fear. And Elena? She was just getting started. A week after her firing, she sat down for her first television interview. The studio lights were bright, and the cameras were rolling, but Elena felt calm, ready. The anchor, Lisa Monroe, leaned forward. "Captain Carter, North Star Airlines claims you were fired for misconduct. What do you say to that?" Elena smiled. "I say that if following federal safety regulations is misconduct, then maybe North Star should rethink its policies." Lisa nodded. "Why did you speak out, knowing the risks?" Elena's voice was steady. "Because I took an oath. Every pilot does. Our job is to protect lives. And North Star put profits over people. I couldn't look the other way." The interview aired nationwide, and within hours, it was trending online. The public was outraged. Passengers started demanding refunds. Lawsuits were already being filed. And then, the final blow landed. 2 weeks after Elena's firing, the FAA issued an emergency ruling. North Star Airlines was officially grounded. The company had violated too many safety regulations, and until a full overhaul was conducted, they couldn't operate. It was over. Elena stood outside the airport, watching as workers began removing North Star's logo from the headquarters building. James walked up beside her. "It's surreal, isn't it?" Elena nodded. "Yeah, but it had to happen." Lauren joined them, shaking her head. "You know, you could have walked away, found another job, But you stayed and fought. Elena glanced at them. Would you have done anything different? Neither of them answered, because they knew the truth. This wasn't just about her career. This was about doing the right thing, even when it cost everything. And looking up at the empty building that once held the power to silence so many, Elena knew it was worth it. Captain Elena Carter stood outside her apartment, coffee in hand, as her phone buzzed nonstop. The fight against North Star Airlines had officially left the corporate world. Now it was in the hands of the public, the government, and the media. The FAA had grounded North Star's fleet. The Justice Department was launching a federal investigation, and now congressional hearings were being scheduled to determine just how deep this corruption went. She had started a fire, and now it was raging out of control, burning everything North Star had built on deception and greed. The Chicago Tribune's first expose had been damning, but now that the FAA and government agencies were involved, every major news outlet was covering the scandal. Elena's name was everywhere. The New York Times, whistleblower Captain Carter takes on airline industry CNN. Aviation cover-up? Inside North Star's safety scandal, ABC News. Passengers react to airline shutdown. We could have died. People weren't just reading the news, they were angry. Former passengers started sharing stories about strange maintenance issues, unexplained delays, and times they felt something was off but were told everything was fine. It wasn't just North Star employees speaking up anymore, it was the entire industry. Other pilots came forward, revealing that North Star wasn't the only airline taking shortcuts on safety. It had been happening everywhere. North Star just got caught first. Elena sat across from her lawyer, Zoe Daniels, as they prepared for the upcoming federal hearings. You're going to be questioned by lawmakers, Zoe said, flipping through a thick binder of case notes. They'll want to know everything, from the first red flag you noticed to the day you got fired. Elena nodded. I'll tell them the truth. Zoe sighed. And North Star will tell their version. Elena smirked. Let them try. Because North Star's executives were already crumbling under pressure. 2 high-ranking officials had resigned, trying to escape accountability. But it was too late. The Justice Department had frozen their assets, preventing them from shifting money around before potential lawsuits hit. The FAA was conducting surprise inspections at other airlines, uncovering more violations. And the public's trust in corporate aviation had never been lower. A week later, Elena walked into one of the most high-profile hearings in aviation history. Cameras flashed as she entered the congressional chamber, where lawmakers, federal regulators, and airline executives sat waiting. At the witness table, she adjusted her microphone and faced the Senate Aviation Committee. Senator David Whitmore, a senior member of the committee, leaned forward. Captain Carter, you risked your entire career to expose these violations. Why? Elena's voice was steady. Because silence kills. And in aviation, ignoring safety to protect profits isn't just unethical, it's deadly. The room stayed silent. Senator Whitmore nodded. What exactly did North Star's leadership do when you raised concerns? Elena exhaled. They retaliated. They reassigned me, tried to push me out, and when that didn't work, they fired me. But their biggest mistake? Assuming I'd stay quiet. The committee members glanced at each other, because they all knew this wasn't just about North Star anymore. This was about an industry-wide problem, and the people who had ignored it for years were now on the defensive. When North Star CEO Thomas Barrett took the stand, he looked visibly shaken. Senators grilled him on falsified maintenance records, retaliations, and the corporate culture that allowed it all to happen. Were you aware that unsafe planes were being cleared for takeoff? One senator demanded. Barrett shifted uncomfortably. We trusted our maintenance teams. That's not what we asked. Another senator slammed down a printout of an internal email, one that Elena had leaked. It was from Barrett himself, instructing executives to minimize maintenance delays to avoid profit loss. He had known, and now he couldn't deny it. 2 weeks after the hearings, the Senate released its official report. North Star Airlines was found guilty of willful negligence, falsifying safety documents, and retaliating against whistleblowers. Multiple executives were indicted, facing criminal charges, and the FAA officially revoked North Star's operating license. The airline was finished. Elena sat in her apartment, watching the news as the final pieces of North Star's downfall unfolded. James texted her. James, they're done. You did it. She exhaled. It wasn't just her. It was everyone who stood up. Lauren, Marcus, James, Peter, and the countless employees who chose truth over fear. They had changed aviation forever. A few days later, Elena got a call from the FAA's Safety Oversight Committee. Captain Carter, we'd like you to help us reform aviation safety policies. We need people like you to prevent this from happening again. She smiled. Let's make sure no airline ever gets away with this again. As she hung up, she knew This fight had never been about just her career. It was about every passenger who put their trust in the skies. And now, the industry would never be the same. Captain Elena Carter stood in front of her television, coffee in hand, as the news played across every major network. Breaking news: North Star Airlines files for bankruptcy following FAA ruling. She had known this moment was coming. For weeks, North Star's leadership had tried to contain the damage, denying allegations, shifting blame, and making desperate attempts to salvage their reputation. But the truth was out, and there was no saving them now. The FAA had revoked their operating license, investors had pulled out, and the Justice Department had charged multiple executives with criminal negligence and fraud. North Star Airlines, once one of the largest carriers in the country, was officially finished. A press conference was being held outside North Star's headquarters, where the company's remaining executives stood behind a podium, struggling to contain the chaos. Thomas Barrett, the disgraced CEO, looked like he hadn't slept in days. His voice was tight, forced, as he read from a prepared statement. After careful consideration, North Star Airlines has decided to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. While we dispute many of the allegations against us, the current situation has made it impossible for us to continue operations. Elena let out a short laugh. They weren't admitting guilt. They were still pretending they were the victims. But the public wasn't fooled. Behind Barrett, furious former employees and passengers had gathered, demanding justice. Mechanics held signs reading, "We told you so." Flight attendants chanted, "Profits over safety kills." Passengers yelled, "You risked our lives." The press bombarded Barrett with questions. "Mr. Barrett, do you take responsibility for putting passengers at risk? Will you cooperate with the Justice Department's investigation? Do you have anything to say to the pilots and employees you retaliated against?" Barrett ignored them, shoving his way past reporters as boos and jeers filled the air. It was over. Elena's phone buzzed nonstop. "James, you seeing this? They're finished. Lauren, they're still trying to spin the narrative, but no one believes them anymore. Marcus, the mechanics are celebrating. We finally got them." Elena smiled, a wave of relief washing over her. For months, she had fought against an airline that had tried to destroy her. They had fired her, threatened her, and painted her as a liar. But in the end, the truth had won. She grabbed her jacket and headed outside. She had one last stop to make. A few hours later, Elena arrived outside North Star's now abandoned headquarters. The massive glass building, once a symbol of corporate power, now stood hollow and lifeless. Workers were already removing the company's logo from the facade, leaving only a faint outline of the once dominant airline. She walked closer, watching as employees carried out boxes, collecting the last remnants of a company that had built itself on lies. A familiar voice called out behind her. "Feels good, doesn't it?" She turned to see Marcus and Lauren standing with a small group of former employees. Elena nodded. "It does, but it shouldn't have taken this much." Lauren sighed. "You're right. We all knew what was happening for years, but no one was willing to risk their careers to stop it. Until you did." Marcus chuckled. "Now, the whole industry is terrified. They're all scrambling to check their safety procedures because they don't want to be the next North Star." Elena smirked. "Good, that's how it should be. Because this wasn't just about North Star anymore. It was about changing the system." Over the next few weeks, other airlines started making changes, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. The FAA launched investigations into multiple carriers, uncovering more safety violations across the industry. New whistleblower protections were introduced, making it harder for airlines to retaliate against employees who reported safety concerns. And most importantly, passengers were paying attention. People weren't just booking flights based on price anymore. They wanted to know which airlines actually prioritized safety. And as for Elena, she wasn't done yet. One morning, as she sat in a cafe, her phone rang. It was David Calloway from the FAA. "Captain Carter, we have an opportunity for you. We're forming a new aviation safety oversight committee, and we'd like you to be a part of it." Elena paused, considering the weight of his words. After everything she had been through, losing her job, fighting for the truth, taking down a corrupt airline, she finally had a chance to make a real lasting difference. She smiled. "Tell me where to sign up." 3 months later, Elena was back in the cockpit, this time flying for a new airline, one that had seen what happened to North Star and wanted to prove they were different. As she guided the plane through takeoff, she glanced at her first officer, a young black woman named Tasha Williams, just starting her career. Tasha smiled. "Captain Carter, I just wanted to say I followed your story. You're the reason I didn't give up." Elena felt a surge of pride, because that was what this fight had always been about, making sure no one ever had to wait outside again. She adjusted her controls, looking out at the endless sky ahead. North Star had fallen. But the future? It was wide open. Captain Elena Carter sat in a quiet cafe, watching the news unfold on the television mounted in the corner. The final chapter of the North Star Airline scandal was playing out, and this time, the people responsible were facing real consequences. A newscaster appeared on the screen, her tone serious. Breaking news: former North Star executives indicted on federal charges. Elena leaned forward, listening carefully. CEO Thomas Barrett, Senior Captain Richard Whitman, and Operations Director Samuel Porter have been formally charged with multiple counts, including fraud, criminal negligence, and obstruction of justice. If convicted, they could each face up to 20 years in federal prison. She exhaled slowly. It was finally happening. For months, North Star's leadership had lied, covered up safety violations, and retaliated against employees who spoke the truth. They thought they were untouchable. Now, they were facing justice. A week later, Elena sat in the courtroom, surrounded by former employees, journalists, and government officials. At the defendant's table, Thomas Barrett sat stiffly, his once confident demeanor shattered. Richard Whitman, the senior captain who had tried to intimidate her, looked even worse, his face pale, his hands clenched. The trial had barely begun, and already, the prosecution was tearing them apart. FAA officials testified about how North Star executives pressured mechanics to sign off on unsafe planes. Pilots admitted they had been threatened with termination if they questioned flight safety. And then, the prosecutor called Elena to the stand. She walked up, taking a seat, and faced the jury. The lead prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Rachel Lawson, approached. "Captain Carter, can you describe the moment you realized something was seriously wrong at North Star?" Elena took a deep breath. "It was the day I was pulled from my first flight assignment. I had been hired as a senior captain, yet at the last second I was told to wait outside while a less experienced pilot took my place. At first I thought it was discrimination, but then I realized it wasn't just about me, it was about control. They were testing whether I would fall in line." Rachel nodded. "And did you?" Elena's lips curled into a small smirk. "No. I started asking questions, and when I did, I found out that North Star had been covering up maintenance failures for years." Barrett shifted uncomfortably. The prosecutor continued. "Can you confirm whether North Star executives were aware of the falsified maintenance reports?" Elena nodded. "Yes. In fact, I have emails from Thomas Barrett and Richard Whitman instructing staff to minimize delays by pushing planes back into service, even when they weren't safe." Rachel turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we'd like to submit these emails as evidence." The defense lawyers looked panicked. Elena glanced at Barrett. His face was now ashen. Because now, there was no escape. The trial lasted 3 weeks, but the verdict came swiftly. The jury found Barrett, Whitman, and Porter guilty on all charges. Elena sat in the courtroom as the judge delivered the sentence. "Thomas Barrett, Richard Whitman, and Samuel Porter, your reckless decisions endangered countless lives. You prioritized profits over safety, silenced those who spoke up, and nearly caused catastrophic disasters. You will each serve 15 to 20 years in federal prison, with no possibility of early parole." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the moment sink in. It was over. They had tried to silence her. They had tried to destroy her career. But in the end, she had taken them down. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed her, microphones extended. "Captain Carter, do you feel justice was served?" one journalist asked. Elena looked directly into the cameras. "Yes, but this wasn't just about North Star. It's about making sure this never happens again." Another reporter pushed forward. "What's next for you?" Elena smiled. "I plan to keep flying, and I plan to keep fighting for safety in aviation, because the sky belongs to everyone, not just the powerful." Applause erupted from the crowd of former employees, pilots, and whistleblowers who had stood with her. Lauren hugged her tightly. "You did it, Elena. We all did." James grinned. "North Star thought they could break you. Instead, you broke them." Elena finally allowed herself to breathe. For the first time in months, she wasn't fighting. She had won, and now she could finally fly free. Captain Elena Carter stood on the steps of the Federal Aviation Administration FAA headquarters, looking out at the crowd of journalists, airline employees, and government officials gathered for the announcement. It had been 6 months since North Star Airlines collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. 6 months since its executives had been convicted of fraud and criminal negligence. But the impact of the scandal hadn't ended there. The aviation industry had been forced to face its darkest truths, and now it was about to change forever. A reporter stepped forward, microphone in hand. "Captain Carter, today marks the first major overhaul of airline safety regulations in over a decade. What does this mean for pilots and passengers? Elena took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. It means the end of an era where airlines could put profits over safety. It means accountability. And most importantly, it means that passengers can board a flight knowing their safety was never compromised for a bottom line. The reporters scribbled notes, cameras flashing as she continued. For too long, airlines operated under the assumption that they could cut corners and silence anyone who spoke up. But North Star's collapse sent a message. If you break the rules, if you endanger lives, there will be consequences. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every pilot, mechanic, and flight attendant who had been ignored, threatened, or fired for trying to do the right thing. The FAA administrator, David Calloway, stepped up beside her. He had been one of the first government officials to take her concerns seriously. Now, he was leading the charge in reforming the industry. As of today, Calloway announced, the FAA is implementing new regulations designed to prevent another North Star scandal. These include mandatory independent safety audits for all airlines every 6 months, stronger whistleblower protections, preventing airlines from retaliating against employees who report safety violations, harsher penalties for falsifying maintenance records, including criminal charges for executives who attempt to cover up violations, the creation of a National Aviation Oversight Committee made up of pilots, mechanics, and regulators to ensure transparency in airline operations. The crowd erupted into applause. It was the most significant change in aviation safety laws in years, and it had started with one pilot refusing to stay silent. The airlines scrambled to adapt. Elena watched as major airlines scrambled to clean up their act. Some had already begun changing their policies, trying to rebuild trust with the public. Others fired their leadership teams, hoping to distance themselves from North Star's fate. But for some companies, it was too little, too late. Another airline, Summit Air, had just been exposed for similar violations, and the FAA had immediately launched an investigation. The industry had been put on notice. The days of getting away with reckless, profit-driven decision-making were over. A week after the FAA's announcement, Elena sat across from Calloway in his office. He leaned forward, folding his hands. Captain Carter, you've done more to change aviation safety than most regulators have in a lifetime. Elena smiled. I wasn't trying to change the industry. I was just trying to stop a disaster. Calloway nodded. That's why I have a proposal for you. She raised an eyebrow. Oh? He handed her a folder. Inside was an offer. The FAA wanted her to serve on the National Aviation Oversight Committee. Her job? To ensure no airline ever became another North Star. Elena exhaled, staring at the document. She had spent her whole career in the cockpit. But this? This was a chance to change the system from within. She glanced up. If I do this, I won't just be signing off on regulations. I want real power to hold airlines accountable. Calloway smirked. That's exactly why we need you. She picked up the pen and signed her name. 3 months later, Elena stood on stage at an aviation safety conference, addressing a room filled with pilots, regulators, and industry leaders. She looked out at the next generation of aviators, young pilots, mechanics, and safety officers who had watched the North Star scandal unfold and vowed never to let history repeat itself. 5 years ago, I never imagined I'd be standing here today, not as just a pilot, but as someone fighting for the future of this industry, she said. I took my first flight at 19 years old. That day, my father told me something I'll never forget. The sky belongs to everyone. And that's the truth. The cockpit belongs to every pilot who earns their place. The maintenance bays belong to every engineer ensuring planes are safe. The terminals belong to every passenger who trusts us to get them home. She paused, letting the words sink in. But trust has to be earned, and for too long, some people in this industry abused that trust. That ends today. Because now, we have safeguards. Now, we have accountability. And now, we have a future where no airline, no executive, can put profit over people ever again. The room erupted into applause, and for the first time since she had started this fight, Elena truly let herself believe it. The industry was changing, and she had helped make it happen. She stepped off the stage, walking past the crowd of eager young pilots who would one day take her place. And as she looked toward the horizon, she knew the sky was finally safe again. Captain Elena Carter adjusted her uniform, feeling the familiar weight of the 4 gold stripes on her sleeves. It had been 1 year since she had exposed North Star Airlines and helped bring sweeping reforms to the aviation industry. A year since she had stood before Congress, testified against corrupt executives, and helped reshape airline safety policies forever. And now, she was back in the cockpit, not just as a pilot, but as a symbol of change. Elena had accepted a senior captain position with Atlantic Airways, one of the first airlines to fully embrace the FAA's new regulations. They had personally recruited her, promising a company culture that valued safety, accountability, and diversity. And today, she was preparing for her first long-haul flight as Atlantic's newest captain. Her co-pilot, a young woman named Tasha Williams, sat beside her in the cockpit, running pre-flight checks. Elena smiled. Tasha reminded her of herself years ago, full of passion, talent, and determination to prove herself in a field that had tried to push people like them aside. "Everything looks good, Captain," Tasha said, her voice steady but excited. "Ready when you are." Elena nodded. "Let's fly." As the Boeing 787 Dreamliner taxied onto the runway, Elena's hands felt steady on the controls. The tower gave the final clearance. "Atlantic Flight 207 cleared for takeoff." Elena smiled, pushing the throttles forward. The engines roared to life, and the aircraft surged down the runway. As they lifted off, climbing through the sky, Tasha turned to her. "Captain, I just wanted to say, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." Elena glanced at her. "You got here because you earned it. I just made sure the doors stayed open." Tasha grinned. "Still, what you did, it changed everything." Elena looked out at the endless blue sky. It had to. Because this wasn't just about her journey anymore. It was about the next generation of pilots, the ones who would never have to fight the battles she did. Because now, they would walk into an industry that valued them. They would fly planes that had been properly maintained. They would work for airlines that put safety over profit. Because she, and the countless others who had fought alongside her, had made sure of it. Hours later, cruising at 35,000 feet, Elena checked her in-flight messages. One caught her attention. Subject, apology. She clicked it open, her brow furrowing. It was from Richard Whitman, the former senior captain of North Star Airlines. The man who had once tried to intimidate her, who had mocked her efforts and stood by as leadership silenced whistleblowers. She read the message carefully. "Captain Carter, I doubt you expected to hear from me. After months of reflection, first during the trial and now during my time in federal custody, I've had a lot to think about. I won't ask for forgiveness and I won't make excuses. I was wrong. I saw what was happening at North Star and I didn't stop it. Worse, I enabled it. I convinced myself I was protecting the company, but in reality, I was protecting my own position. You were right, and I was a coward. You didn't just save lives by exposing us, you saved the industry from itself. I hope one day you'll accept this apology." Richard Whitman. Elena exhaled slowly, reading the message again. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel angry. She just felt tired. Whitman had been part of the system that tried to destroy her, but now, even he had been forced to admit the truth. She took a deep breath and typed a short response. "Mr. Whitman, I appreciate the message. The only way forward is through accountability and change. I hope you mean what you said. The sky belongs to all of us." Captain Carter. She hit send and closed her laptop. Tasha glanced at her. "Everything okay?" Elena nodded. "Yeah, just some old ghosts." Tasha smiled. "You know, you should write a book about all of this." Elena chuckled. "Maybe one day." For now, she had more flying to do. As the flight neared its destination, Elena took a moment to reflect. She had fought battles she never expected. She had lost her job, her reputation. But in the end, she had won something greater. She had won the future of aviation. A future where no pilot would be told to wait outside. A future where airlines could no longer gamble with lives. A future where the truth always had a place to land. The seatbelt sign dinged. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're beginning our descent. On behalf of Atlantic Airways, welcome to San Francisco." Elena smiled. Her journey was far from over. It was just getting started. The story of Captain Elena Carter is more than just an aviation scandal. It is a testament to the power of truth, courage, and perseverance. She faced discrimination, corruption, and retaliation, yet she never wavered in her commitment to doing what was right. Her fight against corporate greed and injustice not only exposed the dangers hidden within the airline industry, but also paved the way for sweeping reforms that will protect future generations. This story reminds us that one person's voice can create lasting change. No matter how powerful the opposition may seem, standing up for what is right will always be worth it. Whether in our communities, workplaces, or daily interactions, we must choose integrity over convenience, justice over silence, and action over fear. If this message resonates with you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let's continue sharing stories that inspire, empower, and remind us of the strength within us all. What are your thoughts on this story? Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you.